I've been awake since 1 a.m., and it's now almost 3 a.m. while I'm drinking wine. I might be developing alcoholism, yet remembered 3 encounters in my life where I've seen shadow people and have decided to share. The first encounter I saw the shadow person was when I was about 11 years old. I was on a camping trip with my cousins. In the early morning, everybody was still asleep, except for me, and I was staring at the side of the tent when I could see a clear outline of a boy wearing a cap on the side of the tent, except instead of being like a normal shadow, it was a solid black in comparison of the shadows of the trees and other things casting over the tent. The boy then repeatedly walked back and forth past the tent. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I was scared, considering I thought a complete stranger was pacing by our tent. When everyone else woke up, we went outside our tent, and there was nobody around. I told my cousins what had happened, and they didn't believe me. Yet, it was like the boy followed me home, because he would appear behind people when I was talking to them outside, in the doorway, or walk along the fence line at random. His appearance wasn't ultimately creepy, besides him appearing at random outside over the course of the year. The last time I saw the boy was when my friend and I had a sleepover, and my mother was working, so we were going outside, not sleeping and messing around. We were in the front yard late at night when we felt like somebody was watching us, so we got a torch and shined it around the yard and then down the street. No one was there yet when we shined the torch over a power pole. We both briefly saw a boy in a cap poking his head out from behind the pole. Yet even when the light hit him, he was still completely black. We shined the torch around the pole for a bit, yet didn't see anyone, so we went inside and locked the door. Nothing else occurred until I was about 14 and encountered the girl, who was ultimately more aggressive and creepier. The first time I met the girl, I was half asleep at a family's friend's house. The family friend had doors in most rooms, except for the makeshift guest room that they had curtains in the doorway for privacy instead of an actual door. Again, it was early morning, and the family friend's kids were running around making noise. I rolled onto my side to see the shadow of a very tall girl in a dress, holding the curtain open, staring at me. I was annoyed and thought it was a resident of the family, and so I said, "What do you want?" Then she immediately vanished, and the curtain even dramatically flickered as if there was a sudden breeze. I went back to sleep. A few days later, again, when I was sleeping, I could feel the blanket slowly dragging down my body. I assumed the blanket was falling off the bed, so I just felt around with my eyes closed and pulled the blanket up. Then, the blanket aggressively whipped down to my ankles. I, still being half asleep, assumed the kids of the house were being little shits and messing with me, so I pulled the blanket back up, wrapped it like a cocoon around me, and gripped onto the blanket at the top. I could feel the blanket really roughly and relentlessly getting tugged. By this time, I was annoyed and just wanted to sleep, so I said, "Just take the fucking blanket then." Letting go of the blanket that basically flew into the air and landed in the entry point of the room. I sat up and realized, number one, there was no one else in the room since I would have heard them, and there are no signs of running or laughing from the kids. 2. The intensity of the blanket was pulled off me, and it couldn't have been done by a child, and was major overkill of blanket snatching. Despite not seeing anything, I was creeped out and ran down the hall into the living room, where I stayed up the rest of the night. Another encounter with the girl, and the more creepy ones, was when I was sleeping on the couch of my older sister's house. I woke up because I felt a big whoosh of air, as if somebody ran at mega speed past the couch. I lay there wondering, what the fuck? Then I saw the clear shadow of a tall girl in a dress run really fast past the couch. By then, I was scared, so I didn't move, and this girl was basically running laps past the couch at super speed, with a whoosh every time she passed. Mind you, this was a living room, so to even pick up a speed this girl was getting at in such a short length of area was supernatural to begin with. I was getting more and more spooked, so I decided to make a fat leap of faith and to try to dart into my sister's and her significant other's room, which meant I had to pass the area where the shadow person version of the Flash was sprinting. When I moved, the girl stopped, then walked around to the edge of the couch and stared at me. I was feeling bold enough to tell her to go away, so she came closer to me. I felt around for a cushion and threw it at her, which went straight through her and didn't do shit. She then basically walked up beside me and started leaning her face towards mine, so I covered mine with a blanket, started crying, and then started saying the Lord's Prayer. I didn't move and eventually fell asleep until the morning. My sister told me in the morning if I kept running around at night, I can get out of her house. The girl would then appear in the corner of my room at night at random. I slept with a nightlight until I was almost 20. The worst and last encounter with her was in my family home. I had a bunk bed that was a double below and single at the top. I slept on the bottom bunk. One night, I woke up to pitch black feet climbing up the ladder of the bunk bed, and then the weight from the top of the bunk, as if someone had plopped down on it. I stared at the top bunk, not knowing what to do when the entire bed frame started shaking and rocking, as if somebody up there was having a seizure. I wasn't going to check it out, and then I started hearing a really harsh and rough breathing with something that almost sounded like growling. So I just started praying because I was too scared to leave the bed. I then slept on the floor of my mother's room for several days. The final time I saw what I assumed to be a shadow person was when I was about 21, and I booked a hotel room with a female cousin. We were going to an event in a city area. My cousin got trashed and I wasn't that interested in drinking. We got back to the hotel and my cousin went straight to sleep. My cousin was laying there sleep-talking, and I was playing on my phone. The beds were separated like typical hotel beds, with a bedside cupboard in between. I looked up, and a tall shadow of a man was standing over my cousin. He simply appeared from nowhere, and I was trying to get to my cousin to wake up. The man immediately whipped his head at me. Because it was a shadow, it had no facial features yet, but it was still staring at me. He then basically zoomed towards my bed, to which I jumped off and switched over the headlights on, and he vanished. My cousin was too drunk to even notice, and I just kept the lights on all night. During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he had leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time and mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and get closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans were to shoot guns, drink beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us busy, cleaning the cabin and moving all of our stuff inside. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to go check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I'd do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make a wise decision. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who it was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned that I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that had just bought. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what happened, but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man that I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height, with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protests, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger. In other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I had seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice now, and it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned to him an owner of one of the surrounding properties had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land. So we grabbed our rifles and went on a search for them. 1 mile or so, down one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot, tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger, when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, The shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled ass out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst part was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked all the weed the night before. Nothing was missing but a box of ammo, and strangely, my sleeping bag and a wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputy's mind that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger, likely to be an escaped con, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year, we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same, and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease was renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I am reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do, once or twice a year, talk to my old college friend on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still hasn't been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called stranger seemed to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there, waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago. To start off this story, it took place 4 years ago. I'm now 17, 5'8" male, and recently found your channel due to some other weird occurrence that happened to me recently, but that is for another time. This took place in December when I was 13. We just had dinner at a local restaurant, and we decided to stay at my grandma's house, so we hopped in the car and drove over to her house. We got there at about 8 and noticed something off about the house. We visit my grandma every weekend ever since I was young, so I can sense when there is something off. I was just about to set my belongings on her brand new couch she'd just bought when I noticed little footprints all over the bottom of my seat. I thought that it was a bit strange, so I went over to my mother, who doesn't believe in ghosts, but in spirits. At first, she didn't believe me and said I was just being a kid, but when I told her to go look at the couch, she was as equally as shocked as I was. My mom asked my grandmother if my little baby cousin had been over that day. My grandmama replied that he hadn't been over there in 5 days, and also she said that she hadn't checked the couch before she left, and there wasn't a single footprint. My mom brushed it off and decided it was nothing. My mom is a realist as well. Later that night, my mom tells me it's time for bed, so I crawl into bed. We went there so much I had my own bedroom. As soon as I hit my pillow, I got a sense of uneasiness, like something was watching me. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, so I attempted to fall asleep. But I still had the sense that I was being watched. I usually never get this vibe from anyone or anything. Anyway, I decided that it was not smart nor safe to stay in that room anymore. So I decided to quickly pack my things and hurry down the hallway to our living room where my mom was. She was annoyed I woke her up because I was feeling something weird in my room. But I told her I did, and I didn't feel comfortable staying in that room, and so I set my things down near the TV and attempted to fall asleep. I had slept for almost an hour when I was awoken by a presence or somebody behind me, which is impossible because I was right behind a sewing machine, and that older than my grandma, and it was too big for a person to stand behind. But I knew if I turned around, I would regret it. So I just waited and waited for what felt like hours, when in reality, it was only like 30 minutes until I worked up the courage to turn around to see what I saw. To my horror, I found a baby's handprint right on the pillow next to my head. I froze, not knowing what I just discovered, but knew it wasn't there when I placed my head on the pillow. I was able to gather myself and turned right back around to attempt to sleep through the night. That didn't work. I instead was so paranoid that I lied awake all night, worried about what's going to happen next. At 3 a.m., the devil's hour, I was just about to doze off until I heard a sound. It sounded like bells or somebody knocking on metal. I just decided to stay put and not investigate. I'm glad I did. The bell's noise went away after 3 a.m., and I relaxed and decided to think my own thoughts. At 5 a.m., my mom got up and went into the kitchen to go get coffee. I got up as well. She asked me how I slept. I told her terrible. She laughed, thinking I was paranoid until I showed her my pillow. She had a look of confusion, but also tried to rationalize the whole situation and told me that it was just a dirt smudge. I got pretty frustrated for her not believing me, but I sighed and knew I know what I saw. Now, ever since this incident occurred, I've had weird and scary incidents happen to me up till recently. 2 weeks after we stayed, my grandfather was taking a walk and he fell on his hip and broke it. He was rushed to the hospital and survived the surgery for his new hip replacement. But sadly, he began losing his independence and now presently has broken his hip twice, gotten real sick, and almost died a few times. Meanwhile, my family had their own issues, but that's another story for later. I will never forget this incident, and I hope whatever demon or thing was there that night, could you kindly fuck off. I come from a small railroad town in Wisconsin, USA. You know, the state with a large roster of known serial killers. And grew up in peak emo scene angsty times, so as a form of entertainment and a subtle nod to what we considered rebellion at our young, naive age, we would walk around town amongst all of the county roads, train tracks, and abandoned buildings scattered throughout our little towns. Most evenings, the scariest thing that would happen is a deer would hop out and spook, or one of our more creative friends would try and convince us of some alien sighting or urban legend that they swore was true, so we didn't take many claims among the group seriously. This evening, however, was different. As we made our way through the shadows, our somewhat large group splintered off into little subgroups of 2s and 3s. We were a fairly large group of friends, varying in age, so the younger ones would often pool together towards the middle of our caravan, while the older characters in our bunch held ranks on the outer edges. As we made our way back to one of the boys from our group's home, one of the more dramatic members of our swoop bang pack claimed there was someone driving behind us at a distance slowly with the headlights off. We all scoffed and started making jabs at him, along with some childish ghost noises, mocking that the ghost car was going to get us. A few more blocks down, this boy that had claimed to have spotted a stalker grew more and more uneasy and stuttered out, "You guys, seriously, they were getting closer. I could hear the tires on the gravel." Noticing how anxious he now seemed and how far we still had to go to get to the older members of the group, began to take his claims more seriously, but did so in a way that would freak out the younger members. As we made our turn onto the paved road, that meant we were 2 turns away from our safe haven. I said, "Hey, first one to arrive at the house gets to pick a movie we all watch." Since the younger children were usually subjected to watching whatever boring or spooky things the older ones of us put on, this made them take off at a full sprint. As soon as our feet hit the pavement and we started our fast-paced race back to the promised land of locked doors and my friend's parents waiting for us, headlights flicker on and sync with the roar of an older modeled engine. At this point, the younger children are running and yelling in unison and questioning what was happening and who was that. I surpassed the younger children and saw the sign that held the name of their housing complex that was nuzzled in a few trees. As I saw this, I yelled, "Everyone under the sign!" We all skidded to a stop and rolled underneath as the man slammed his brakes to a screeching stop. He threw his vehicle into reverse and began to circle the sign. I noticed his overhead light was on that cast an unsettling shadow over his face that appeared to consist of glasses that were far thicker than the seemingly thin hair that the light shone through like a thin veil. Finally, as he rounded the part of the sign that was the sharpest turn to move, I whispered loudly, "All right, everybody, to the neighbors' yards, let's go." We all moved at record speeds in comparison to our sluggish paces that we usually assumed on these late-night endeavors. As we ran through the blackness that was slowly only getting darker due to the thick cover of trees that now surrounded us, we suddenly and unfortunately realized that our neighbor had an otherwise beautifully landscaped yard that had small bridges and ponds throughout it. As many of us ran while jumping over small ditches, decorative hills, and lawn ornaments, we finally saw the road that separated the neighbors from our final destination. As we all approached the road, I saw a gleam of headlights approaching to our left, nearing the road that we needed to cross to finally achieve our sanctuary for the evening. As I saw these headlights approaching, I yelled, "Run! He is coming, we gotta go!" As all but one of us made it past me to the safety of the yard, I heard a faint "ow" behind me. As I looked back, I saw the youngest and by far smallest member of our ranks holding their knee while rocking next to a large rock. I looked at the small child and back of the vehicle that was now speeding to turn down the road and towards us. I ran back to the child and scooped them up while yelling, "Leave the door open! Leave the door open!" The rest was a weird combination of slow motion mixed with the quickest experience of my life. The vehicle sped and narrowly missed us. When I arrived at the door, I dove while holding the crying child as though I was some athlete, cradling the ball for the final score of the game. One of the other older children slammed the door behind us, and we all sat and silently sobbed while we told his parents what had just ensued. We begged his parents not to tell the cops since we were all up past our small town's curfew. Now that I'm older, I wish that we would have at least told the non-emergency line, so it was on record, but it is what it is. To this day, I'm very wary of walking home alone at night, and now that I have a son of my own, and he is nearing the age where he will start to want to adventure on his own, I will tell him this story, so that he knows some scary stories are real. This is a recounting of a terrifying incident that 3 of my friends experienced during the summer after our junior year in high school. I very nearly became part of the tale myself, but a scheduled shift at the movie theater saved me. They showed up at my house earlier that day, asking if I wanted to go with them into the woods to explore an area we had yet to search. But I had to work later that evening, so had to decline. It's been over 25 years since this occurred. Therefore, not all that happened can be remembered, but I will do my best. Looking back now at that way of life was then, I can positively say things have changed greatly for kids. My neighborhood was its own self-contained city on the edge of city limits. At the end of the 60s, some idealistic developer got the crazy idea to buy up hundreds of rolling acres of prairie and forest land out in the middle of nowhere. He created a little suburb sprawl for the coming rise of manufacturing and the people needed to fill those jobs. The factories did come. Johnson & Johnson, Folgers Coffee, places such as that. But within 30 years, they would begin to leave just as quickly. The children of these factory workers found themselves separated from their peers in the rest of the city, and with nothing better to do, took to the woods surrounding them to explore and discover nature, much as their distant ancestors who settled this land hundreds of years before. I was one of these children, and so were my 3 friends who would make the discovery on one of these journeys into the woods. Without me along, they took to the fields opposite the new highway. These stretched for miles back then, and during this summer, were laying fallow. Our part of Texas rides the line between prairie land and a forest. You may find yourself walking for miles on open land, only to discover acres upon acres of woods being the next field. After walking for miles across nothing, they came upon a forested area most of us had yet to explore. A path led to an abandoned barn. When they turned the corner to look inside of it, they came face to face with the corpse of a hanged man. From what I was told later, not a single one of them believed it to be real. However, as they got closer, there was no longer any doubt. The body was that of a trucker who had parked his 18-wheeler at the nearby truck stop around Christmas. He walked the 3 or so miles into the woods and ended his life. To this day, no one knows if he knew that the barn was there or he just happened upon it. But we do know, on that hot, humid summer day, his bloated body posed a horrific sight to them. Realizing someone was likely missing him, my friends returned to the very same truck stop he had walked away from the year before and called the cops. Of course, I didn't hear all about this until the next day. Even though it did sound like an amazing adventure, I'm thankful I had to sit it out. All 3 of them went on to differing levels of illegal and emotional troubles, including battles with drug addiction. The only one left living, Stephen, has spent several stints in and out of institutions, and the last time we spoke, little of my childhood friend remained. I can't claim that the discovery of the trucker's body was the only reason for their eventual decline, but it most certainly contributed to it. I live in a rural area in the Midwest, one of those areas that have nothing but acres of land around you. I came to learn a few years ago, the land where my house was built over 80 years ago, was once a farmland with slaves who were chained up in the wooden cabins when they weren't needed. Honestly, hearing that story broke my heart, and I hoped and prayed that those slaves found peace in the afterlife. When we first moved into this house, there was an old barn that was still standing a bit far from the house, but I never went into it, and turns out the owner already sold the barn before he sold us the house, and it was due to being taken down. It wasn't long before a crew came in and started taking it down, but before they could finish it, ended up collapsing and coming down on its own. We're the last house on the street, and a bit further down the road from my house is a very tiny, old, and what I assume to be a family-owned cemetery. And when I say old, I mean so old that you can't even read the names on the tombstones, which are very thin and clearly were handmade, and because of that, little cemetery, I always had a feeling these houses would be haunted. And I can't speak for my neighbors, but I definitely know mine is, but that's another story. My room is on the bottom floor and faces the backyard, and also the stairs that lead up onto a landing that leads up to the deck. And one autumn night, I'm sitting in my room with the window open, enjoying the cooler weather, when I heard someone walking up and down the stairs. I think it's my uncle, so I didn't bother to look, but after I kept hearing those footsteps, wondering why he could have been walking up and down them so much, and I became confused when I looked over and saw absolutely no one. I got up, walked to the window to see if maybe it was my uncle, and he just stepped out of view. But no, there was no one. A few seconds later, I began to hear those footsteps again, and I immediately panic and slam my window shut. Lock it, put down the blinds, pull the curtains, jumped back into my bed, trying to process what just happened. After I calm down and get back to working on my computer, that's when I start to hear tapping on my window. And not just regular tapping. It was always 3 taps. Being an avid Ghost Adventures fan, I learned. I also learned that if something taps or knocks 3 times, then it's demonic. So I do my best to calm my beating heart and just act like I didn't hear it, which was a mistake on my part, because the taps went from light to heavy and just happened a few seconds apart, always being in 3s. My grandmother, who was in her bedroom down the hall from me, ended up hearing the tapping and came to my room to see if I heard it also, and I told her, yes, it's right outside my window. My grandmother, being the fearless woman she is, went to the back door, flipped the light on, and opened the door looking right down to where my bedroom window is, then looked at me and said, "Baby, there's nothing there." I ended up texting my cousin, who was upstairs at the time, asking if he heard it, and he said, "Yeah, but thought it was your grandma doing something downstairs making that noise." And I told him no, I was on the computer, and grandma was asleep. We weren't doing anything. A few minutes later, he texted me back, saying he went outside and looked and saw nothing. The tapping stopped, that I guess whatever it was didn't like that it caught the attention of my family. I still live in that house, and nothing like that has happened again, and honestly, I don't ever want it to. I hate to think that it was something demonic, and it was targeting me. I am no stranger to sleep paralysis. I have suffered it from childhood. I will be the first to admit that I did not understand it. I honestly believed during that time I was somewhere between life and death. Trying to explain it to my parents, who equally did not understand it. I was afraid to talk about it after the initial talk with my parents, so I did not want to appear crazy. It was not until I went to school to be an RN that I fully understood it. Yet I will also admit, I never saw anything. Not demons, not shadow people, not even lucid dreaming. It just became a part of my life. I accepted, until now. I have many family scattered throughout the States, as well as Ireland. I travel between the two, actually. Last night, however, something changed. I flew from County Kerry, spent a couple of nights in NYC before traveling to a small town in Missouri to visit a beloved uncle. He is single and owns a huge house that sits on a lake. Table Rock. When I say huge, I mean huge. Several bedrooms that each hold a bath as well as a separate. It should be turned into a bed and breakfast. He gave me a choice of rooms, and I chose one overlooking the lake, as opposed to one overlooking the gardens, as it is currently wintertime. My uncle also owns this little 4.5 kilogram dog that yaps at its own shadow. For reference, I am not a pet person. I own a dog that I love, yet I tolerate other people's pets. So naturally, for the most part, ignored this tiny dog. I tucked into bed, wondering if I could acclimate to the time change. I promise I closed the door to my room. I woke up to this tiny dog on my chest, yapping. Come on, a tiny dog yaps, not barks, and looking at the door. I realized I was in sleep paralysis. My first thought was not what the dog may have been yapping at, just that he was. My second thought was, I closed my door, how the feck did he get in? I was able to turn my head towards the door. Anyone who has suffered sleep paralysis knows what a feat that is. Yet I still could not turn my body. Then I saw it. Him, whatever. The shadow person. He took up the entire door frame. Was my first or second reaction fear? No. I was still wondering why the door was open. I thought to myself, alright, I am obviously in sleep paralysis. Usually when this happens, I just tell myself, there's nothing else to do but go back to sleep. Or I can try to figure this out. So I looked at him. He was nothing but shadow. Yet I had the feeling I was looking in his eyes as he was looking in mine. All the time, this dog is yapping. I got the feeling he wanted to cause terror and fear in me. Yet as we looked at each other, I was curious about him. I felt his malice change to one of curiosity himself. He did not understand why I was not afraid. He was just as curious about me as I was to him. All at once, the hall light went on. He disappeared. I heard my uncle say to his dog, "Stop barking at so-and-so." The dog left me at this point and went with my uncle. I was released from the paralysis and walked over to my door and locked it. You may wonder how I could do this so nonchalantly and wrap myself in my blankets and fall right back asleep. I can only say it was my rational and analytical mind. Surely such things do not happen, right? The next morning, my uncle made salmon and baked berries. See why I said this house should be a bed and breakfast? I was not going to talk about the night's events before, until my uncle said, "You saw the Shadow Man, did you not?" For the first time, and of course, I was at a loss for words. During the early 2000s, when I was attending law school, I worked nights delivering pizza for one of the national chains. I had done something similar when I was younger and attending my local community college. Anytime I found myself sorely in need of quick cash, that was the avenue I would choose. Despite the many stories I have heard questioning the safety of the job, I never had a single run-in with a thief. I'm sure back in the early days, it could be a little dangerous, but by the time I joined the game, companies had learned that implementing practices such as limiting the driver to $20 lowered the chance of holdups drastically. Even though I was never a victim of a robbery, I did have one or two scary incidents I could write about. The worst of these happened to me back in the 2000s. I was very familiar with the city I was living in at the time. Moving there after junior college and delivering for several places over the last 5 years had made me intimate with almost every nook and cranny of the place. However, one evening, I would be called to an address that I, nor any of the other drivers, even knew existed. When the order came in, I went straight to the map to find the address, but it wasn't there. Not even the GPS on my phone showed it. We didn't have any no delivery areas at the time, so I had to take it, despite my misgivings. Theoretically, the place would have existed if the road continued for 10 more blocks, so I turned onto said road, a block before its ending, and followed it south. Sure enough, a newly paved road began where the old one should have ended. For what seemed like miles, I continued on this new section of road. Nothing stood on either side of it, and I didn't pass another car the whole time. How the state managed to build it without a single report of its creation leaking to the media had me bewildered. The 5 years I'd been driving all over this city, I'd not known this part existed. In one way, I was very excited seeing all of it, like a Victorian explorer tracing the source of the Nile. But at the same time, a deserted road popping up out of nowhere gave me a chill down my spine. It must have been a good 10 minutes before the house in question appeared in the distance. I couldn't understand why someone would build a house out here in the middle of nowhere with no way to reach it. When I got closer, I could see the house had to be at least 50 years old or more, and probably hadn't been repaired since then. No cars were around, and for a moment, I thought the house was abandoned. But I could see the front door wide open, behind the rickety old screen. Everything looked to be above board, so I grabbed the pizza and headed for the door. I knocked on the screen door, but got no answer. I could see what appeared to be a young female walking around the kitchen. When I knocked a second time, I heard a female voice say to come in. Despite my reservations, I stepped just inside the house and waited in the small foyer area. I learned from other drivers early on to not enter an unfamiliar house, but I had yet to see anything to concern me. I assumed the woman would be coming out soon to pay me. Instead, I overheard an unseen man whisper, "Call him into the kitchen." When I heard that, I fled from the place as fast as I could. I was so freaked out, I got back to the restaurant in half the time it took me to get to the house. After I told my boss what had just occurred, he called the police. All the excitement had me rattled, so my boss sent me home for the day. My phone rang a few hours later. It was the police. They called to let me know what they had found. Whoever had been there was gone now. Even though the place had more than likely been abandoned for a while, they did find evidence that people had just recently been inside. This was stuff my boss had already told them. However, they did shed some light on where the road came from and why the house was the only building on an otherwise deserted area. The state had been trying to purchase the land on which the new section of road and house were for 20 years, but the landowner wouldn't sell. They even tried to use eminent domain to get it, but a judge blocked it. Around 2 years before, the owner passed, and his children finally sold the land to the state. They were so happy to get the land after all that time that construction on the road was started immediately. It technically had yet to be formally opened, but locals had already begun using it anyway. This was good to know, but I still wondered how the two people knew about the empty house sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. This was something the officer did not know. We could only assume they drove past it and decided it would be as good as a place as any to ambush a delivery driver. Even $20 is a good score if you're desperate enough. He said from personal experience, people had killed for much less. The officer left me with one good piece of news though. The county had slated the old house to be demolished in the coming week, so no other poor delivery driver would be let out there to be robbed or worse. 2 days later, I was driving down the brand new road, which I was now using as a shortcut across town, and witnessed the house's destruction. A load was being lifted from my shoulders right before my eyes. Never again would I enter a customer's home or even deliver to an area in which I was not well versed. Perhaps in the future, I'll share my other story. While not as harrowing, it was still scary nonetheless. I'm about 17 at the time I'm writing this, and this story happened about 6 years ago, but I've still never forgotten it. Up until the night that this happened, I had never believed in ghosts, but now I don't know what to believe in. I was about 11, and I was living in this house that we had just moved into. It wasn't very big, but it was spacious. It was one of those houses where there was another family occupying the other half of the building, and the people living next door told me that the previous tenants were Satanists and constantly tried to summon spirits and demons. At the time, I thought this was just them trying to scare an innocent child, but I would soon find out that this wasn't the case. I never had sleep paralysis or anything of the sort, and this was the only time that this had happened in the year that me and my mother lived in that house. I woke up one night, and I realized that I couldn't get up. I was able to move, but it was much more of a struggle, like some unforeseen force was holding me down, preventing from being able to get up. I struggled for a few more minutes, until eventually giving up, and that's when I saw it in the corner of my eye. There was what appeared to be a man, made of shadow in the darkness. I was so scared that I peed the bed, but I was unable to say anything. I just stared, unable to move or speak. Eventually, I heard whispers. They were mostly incoherent, but I did manage to hear one part. The figure looked at me and said, "Don't worry, I'm not here for you." When it spoke, it sounded like it was trying to speak over multiple people whispering, but after it said that, it left. A few minutes later, I was able to move again, and I ran straight to my mom and woke her up. I told her that there was a man in my room. When I told her, she freaked out and grabbed a knife. I explained to her that it was a shadow man, but she didn't believe me. We then cleaned my sheets, and I went back to bed the next morning, When I woke up, I found out that the neighbors who live in the other half of the house, their grandfather had died in his sleep. I'm sure that is what the spirit meant by, "I'm not here for you." I'm not entirely sure, but I think I saw the Grim Reaper that night. I've had nightmares about the night for years, and I was afraid to tell anyone, but my mom and best friend, out of fear that I might be the next person. I'm sure the Grim Reaper doesn't want people telling others his business. I've always been sensitive to the other side. I won't dive into all of the occurrences I've had. Anyone interested can message me for stories. Anywhere from shadow figures, doppelgangers, Michigan Wolfman, poltergeists, possible demons, and more. It's been a very interesting life. None of these stories include the random dangerous encounters with strangers either. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody listening to this or reading this is already rolling their eyes, much like I do from time to time. I digress. I am a 29-year-old female, and as recently as September of 2019, I purchased a house. It's an older home, built in the 1800s. It's sturdy and has plenty of rooms, 2 bedrooms upstairs and down. My room, the largest of all of them, has a walk-in closet the size of a small child's bedroom, a crawl space attic above that, and finally, at the back of the closet is a door to an unfinished, unused type of walk-in attic space. I wanted to turn it into a small reading nook in the future, but now my unease towards that area is becoming unresolvable. I almost never use my closet. I've noticed small things here and there that hinted at paranormal. Despite my sensitivity to the realm, I try to explain happenings rationally before outright jumping to demon in my house. Such things include shadows without a source, voices from my closet, items missing or moved, cold spots, bangs on walls, doors being closed that I'd left open, etc. Typical shit. A lot of these things can be explained by me just being forgetful, or the fact that the house is almost 200 years old. However, no touching until this morning. I'm a bartender. My night ends around 4 a.m. by the time I'm finished at work, get home, get ready, and into bed. I was lying in bed, sleep mask on, stories queued up and ready to sleep. I turned out my light and settled in. I was still wide awake and just getting comfortable. I'm a left side sleeper, and I'm stretched into my favorite position. Legs stacked, right foot behind the left with the inside of my foot touching the mattress. Imagine a very loose fetal position. So, I'm comfortable, and suddenly, I feel the sensation of a finger press gently into the inside of my right foot, the one against the mattress, and travel from my arch to my heel and sink away. I tried not to panic. I kept my breathing steady. I thought throughout every rational explanation I could come up with, and roll over. Similar position, opposite side. It didn't happen again, and I willed myself to sleep. As I mentioned before, I have seen and heard hints towards the paranormal, but only recently have these things escalated. This touch wasn't the first occurrence of it letting me know. It is, however, the first that I can't justify with a rational answer. The first time was before the light in the hall had been installed, so there was no light to go by. I had just left my bathroom and stepped onto the landing of the stairs when I heard the shower door rattle and slide partially. My cat was steadily beside me, bouncing and chirping because I was headed downstairs, and at the noise, she stopped and turned to the bathroom. As I put my foot out to take a step down, I heard the landing behind me creak and groan as the weight was being put on it, heavier than mine and painfully slow. I felt an agonizing sense of dread that someone was towering over me in my small hallway. However, I chose to ignore it and just went down the stairs, with my girl eagerly racing me. I rationalized that it's an older home and creaks, but I still called my boyfriend and explained what happened on my way to work. He has seen and felt things here too, and I think that's why he doesn't stay the night much anymore. I know it's because I started doing renovations to the house. I'm trying to return it to the glorious old house it once was, with very minimal modern flair. The electricians used that crawl space in my closet to install the fixture above my stairwell, and I believe it woke something up. Something much more interested in me than I am in it. Because my parents had separated before I was born, I spent my time growing up between each of their houses. Each summer, until I turned 19, I stayed with my dad in rural Missouri. He had grown up in the area himself, and most of his family still lived there. Without much to do, like going to the movies and stuff, I would fill my days hanging out with my older cousin and getting into mischief. Many of our long summer days were taken in wandering the surrounding woods. On one of these journeys, we came across a big lake, sitting quietly by itself out in the middle of nowhere. The water was crystal clear and filled with tons of monstrous fish. We asked the adults if they were aware of its existence, but none had heard of it. That was probably the reason for it having so many large fish. No one living in the area had fished it, and any who had in the past allowed its location to be lost. We would fish the pond 3 or 4 times, coming away with a stringer full of lunkers on each occasion. On the 5th occasion, we hoped to accumulate enough for a big family fish fry. The summer holiday was starting to wind down, and we figured a fish fry would be a great way to cap it off. It was a warm Saturday morning when we headed out. We started about an hour before sunup because the walk-in took over an hour. Besides, the fish stopped biting by the hottest part of the day, and we hoped to get back to my dad's house by early afternoon. The beautiful sight of the pond came into view just around dawn. It didn't take long for us to get our first bites, and for the next 3 hours, the fish came quickly, one after another. Our limit was caught by 10:45, and I was rearing to get going. We had a 90-minute walk back with 2 5-gallon buckets packed to the top with fish, so I imagined another 30 could be added to that. To my displeasure, my cousin thought it would be refreshing to take a dip in the lake before we left. He tried to pressure me into joining him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. I just wanted to get back, but he was older than me, so he was in charge. I plopped my tail onto a rock and waited while he did his thing. There was an old rope tied to a tree, probably from 100 years ago, and he wanted to swing from it. It looked unsafe to me. However, my concerns were laughed off, and he stripped down to his boxers, setting his clothes on the ground next to me. He climbed the tree a little way and grabbed onto the rope. Pushing off, he swung out just a short distance before the rope snapped right above him. He'd made it out far enough to hit the deep water, but probably not as far as he intended. When he hit the water, his body made a dull thud sound. It certainly didn't sound normal, and likely hurt. I was planning on laughing at him and saying I told you so, but as seconds passed, he never resurfaced. The situation was quickly becoming scary. I looked around to see if he came up somewhere farther away, perhaps floating unconscious because of the hard contact with the water, but still nothing. I was beginning to panic and waded out as far as I dare, looking into the water for him. Unfortunately, the water became cloudy with every step I took and made it impossible to see. Soon, it was clear to me that he had drowned. How? I had no idea. Perhaps if I could have swum back then, I may have been able to help him. But it was too late now. I was helpless to do anything more than pack up and head home. On the entire walk back, a small nugget of hope lingered in the back of my mind that he had tricked me and would pop up at some point. This didn't happen, however, and the dread I carried of telling my family grew with each and every step. I tried several times to find the words, but with each attempt, I would break down and choke on my tears. Ultimately, I could only manage, "Mark drowned." They got the point after that, and once I was able to pull myself together, I led my dad and uncle back out to the pond. Mark's body was still nowhere to be found. With no other options, We went into the sheriff's office to report the drowning. When I realized where we were headed, I started freaking out. In my young mind, I thought I was going to get in trouble or be blamed for my cousin's death. It took a few moments, but they were able to convince me that I was not in trouble. Even after they had, I couldn't help but feel guilty every time I looked at my uncle. Regardless of what he claimed, I couldn't believe he didn't blame me, even if it was just a small amount. I explained what happened to the sheriff, and the search began the next morning. Just by chance, that was the day I was going back to my mom's. That Monday night, my mom sat me down to tell me that a team of divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. When they discovered him, one of his feet were hung up on a sunken log, so they assumed that was why he never surfaced. I wish I could say this made me feel better, but it did not. It did, however, serve as a catalyst to learn how to swim. The guilt of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for most of my life, and I never wanted to be in a position of not being able to help another person, ever again. So, in a twisted kind of way, his death had a positive impact on my life. However, if I had the choice, I prefer he still be with us. I live east of the great city of Atlanta, and the area around me has a very rich history, especially with the Civil War. One day, me and my friends decided to go to a place called Allatoona Pass. It's a long trail that has been converted for walking and used to be the site of the train tracks that ran through the town of Ackworth during the Civil War. In October of 1864, it was the site of a battle called the Battle of Allatoona Pass, when the Confederates attacked the Union held fort on top of the hill next to the tracks. The battle raged on for only a day and a half, and over 1,600 men perished before the Confederacy finally surrendered. Because so many perished, there have been legends for many, many years of it being haunted. This intrigued me and my then friends, and we went out to Allatoona Pass a little after midnight. We were wandering around and walking down the trail, talking to each other and exploring. After walking around for about 10 minutes, we reached the end of the open tunnel that runs to the mountain and decided to turn back. The names had been changed, but other than myself, there were 3 other people. We will call them Sandy, Corey, and Michael. While slowly making our way to the entrance of the tunnel, we started hearing movement above the 65-foot drop cliff, which makes up the sides of the tunnel, twigs snapping, rocks falling, and leaves being crushed. At this point, me and Sandy are clutching together, and Corey and Michael are following closely behind. Although he has never claimed to have a sixth sense, Corey, Sandy, and I also knew that Michael was able to see and hear things that none of us could. After deciphering the answers to a few questions that were asked, we were able to figure out that there were 3 Union soldiers near us. One was a man about 35 years old. One was a boy, about 17, and the third was a man who was about 23 years old. We were asking questions like, "Do you miss your family?" To which they would scream yes. "Do you want a cigarette?" To which one answered, "I just quit." And then finally, Michael said the older man said, "You don't have to be afraid of us, that we are protecting you from something in the distance." Once that was said, Sandy screamed and ran out of the tunnel, all of us following, kicking rocks, and running as fast as we could. Finally, we got to my truck, which was parked in the parking lot, and tried to calm our nerves. I threw down the tailgate, shaking, and sat down with Sandy and lit a cigarette to calm me down. As we were talking and laughing about how big of scaredy cats we are, Michael spoke up and said I'm going back in. After a minute of us refusing and pleading for him to stay with us, he picked up a bag and a big stick and walked back into the tunnel alone. And we watched, worried as he disappeared into the darkness. A few minutes later, he comes back, stick in hand, and there is something different about him. He seemed overly happy and giddy, and then he spoke. "I know what was watching us," he said, smiling. I shivered because his smile creeped me out more than the tunnel, and we asked, "Okay, what was it?" After a short pause, he said Zozo. After that, we flew into the car and burned rubber to get out of there. I had heard many stories and researched about Ouija boards before this, so I knew of Zozo and what he was capable of. I have been back to Allatoona Pass since that night, both during the day and at night, but if I'm ever there at night, I will not enter the tunnel because I know what is lurking in the dark. I have heard many instances and even witnessed people using a Ouija board inside the tunnel, and I personally believe that the people using a Ouija board opened a portal for Zozo to come through and was never closed. Perhaps he can move freely between open portals, but who knows? All I know is that what I felt and heard that night was enough for me. I know most of us believe in ghosts. The question is, have you seen one? For years I've watched ghost shows like Ghost Adventures, but I never thought I'd see one. I've always just explained away bumps in the night. But here's two stories that, to me, still send shivers up my spine. Back in 2013, I had just turned 19, lived in a super small town in Alberta, Canada. That year, the rivers surrounding the town flooded. Homes were lost, as well as lives in surrounding communities. I believe this is what made the energy in these homes stronger. At the time, I was living with my boyfriend's family in a very old home, estimated about 112 years old at the time. It was just a small, typical farmhouse, moved into town from an unknown farm in Alberta. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, with a new add-on basement with 2 other bedrooms. Picture an old farmhouse, the very original hardwood floors, white crown moldings, very tight hallways and small rooms. Me and my boyfriend's room was in the add-on basement. It was always freezing and very, very dark. Now, before I moved in his house, his mom used to witness a dark figure standing outside the house, just staring in through the windows at night. Whatever this thing was, would bang on the doors and exterior walls. Now, when anyone new would move in, that figure would then come in the house too. New neighbors moved in next door, and things started getting strange. Every day when everybody would get home from work, things would be moved around and rummaged through, but nothing would be taken. So we assumed the neighbors were coming in the house. One day, me and my boyfriend got home before anybody else, and like normal things were moved around. So we cleansed everything else and went downstairs to relax before bed. His family had 3 dogs at the time, and you could hear them walking around upstairs. We finally get ready for bed and lie down. All of a sudden, we hear somebody run around upstairs. Not the dogs walking around, but a person stomping. But none of the dogs were barking or getting upset. No one else was going to be home till 11 p.m. or later. We call his mom, asking if she had gotten home, and the answer was no. So my boyfriend jumps out of bed and grabs a shotgun, thinking somebody had broken into the house. He sweeps the house room to room, and nothing. No one but the dogs and us were there. As soon as we get back to lay down, after finding out no one was there, whatever had walked through the house before runs out. One day, I was staying at my boyfriend's sister's house for the night. This home she owns and is very haunted. Her daughters talk to a person named OG, scream and yell that this thing is scaring them. The motion sensor toys go off all the time, so on. Anyway, this night, I was just falling asleep on the couch, and out of the corner of my eye, something keeps moving in the kitchen, next to the living room. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, I wake up to a chill running down my spine. I go to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As I walk into the kitchen, the overhead light flicks on, and I turn to tell the kids it's late and time for bed. But instead, I see a woman in a white dress. Her body was deformed. Her long dark hair was covering her face. Think the girl from The Grudge hair. Then as soon as the light flicked on, it goes off, and she's gone. This house is built next to an old, unmarked graveyard. All of the family has seen this woman walking through the house and the yard. I think it's evil, as the kids are so scared of it, and say she does mean things to them, and lives on the ceiling. Needless to say, those homes scare me and everybody who lives in them. Are ghosts real? Well, now I know they are. This happened to me and my cousin, who I'll call Blake for this story, back in the fall of 2009. Our grandma decided to let us stay the night over at her house, as she often did, because me and my cousin were really close, and she was the only relative that let us stay the night at her house. Now, her house was always creepy to us, and we always said that our papa, who passed away about 6 years before this, was still in the house watching over us. Looking back, it really didn't make sense, but it did help us sleep at night. Anyway, that night, after rounds of junk food and Call of Duty, we decided it was time for bed. Now, one thing we always did in my grandmother's house was sleep with the TV on. That will be relevant in a minute. As we lay in our beds, we heard a loud thud come from downstairs. My eyes shot open and looked towards the door. Now, the TV wasn't super quiet, but it wasn't super loud either. Not to mention we were on the second floor of the house, so the fact that I heard that big of a thud was a little worrying to me. I turned over and shook Blake to see if he was still awake. Turns out he had been awake for longer than me because he couldn't sleep, so he heard the thud too. "What was that?" I asked him. "I have no idea. You think we should check it out?" he asked me. "Yeah, we need to make sure Mama is okay." That was the one mistake that possibly led to what happened afterwards. We both got up and slowly approached the door. I turned the knob and opened the door. We stepped outside onto the landing. I started to turn and walk down the stairs when Blake stopped me. I turned and he seemed like he was listening for something. Then, another loud thud came from the downstairs. So being the idiots we were, we didn't think about it being an intruder. So we thought it was a ghost. I was really into ghost hunters and shows like that at the time, so I pulled out my sister's old Razor flip phone and started to record us asking questions. "Is there somebody here with us?" I asked. No response. "Papa, is that you?" Blake asked. Just then, a huge crash could be heard, like something made of glass had hit the floor. We scrambled into the bedroom. Once we were both inside, I slammed the door shut, and I breathed a sigh of relief, until I heard what sounded like somebody was going through the drawer on the nightstand. I turned and looked at Blake. He was paralyzed, staring towards his side of the bed. The nightstand drawer was open. Again, following what I had seen done before, I pulled up the thermal filter on the camera on my phone. What I saw turned my blood to ice. A shadowy, humanoid figure was bent over and was digging through the drawer. My cousin had snapped out of his trance and looked at the phone. He gasped. Then the thing jerked its head to look at us. I knew it was caught. It then stood up straight and then turned to face us. I was shitting myself at this point. I just knew this thing was going to kill us both, and no one would know what happened. But then, something weird had happened. It disappeared, almost like it was blinked out of existence. I wasted no time. I tore open the door and practically flew down the stairs. I ran into the spare bedroom downstairs and turned to see if Blake had followed me. Thankfully, he wasn't too far behind. Once we were both inside, I slammed the door and locked it. "What was that thing?" Blake asked me. "I don't know, but I'm not going to sleep. I don't want that thing to sneak up on us." And we didn't. We stayed up watching these old sitcoms that networks would play in the early morning until we saw sunlight peeking through the blinds in the room. We both then passed out. When we woke up, our grandmother had just asked us what we were doing last night, because all she heard was banging all night long. Both of our faces drained of color, but we didn't want to tell her what we saw, so we just said we couldn't sleep and stayed up most of the night. I wish that was the end, but one more terrifying event would unfold. We got my phone to go back and check the recording we had. You could hear me ask my question, and we heard no response. But when Blake asked his question, he got an answer. About 5 seconds later, he asked if our papa was there with us. We heard a harsh whisper say yes. A few weeks later, my sister and our cousin Lee were sleeping upstairs in the dead of night, when all of a sudden, she was awoken by what sounded like a deck of cards being shuffled. But somehow, she managed to fall back asleep. Not even an hour later, Lee was awoken by a blood-curdling scream coming from the far corner of the room. She then woke my sister up, and they ran downstairs to sleep on the couch. She said it was like that it came from a woman, then reluctantly told her what me and Blake encountered a couple years before. She looked at me in shock. That was the last creepy thing to have ever happened to us in that house, because as life went on, we started going to her house less and less. It got to the point to where all of us had forgotten all of these things that had happened. I brought it up a few years later, and it still sent shivers down my cousin's spine. A new family bought the house after my grandmother had passed away a couple of years ago, so I only pray that whatever was in that house is gone now. I found out a few years later that what we saw was a shadow person. I don't know why it was at that house or what it was looking for, but it sends shivers down my spine to know whatever it was up there could have been watching us while we slept. It was Friday night and had just gotten home from spending the whole day with Jay, who was my boyfriend at the time and now is my husband. At the time, I lived with my mom, stepdad, triplet brothers in a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo. My family was going through some hard times, and that was all we could afford at the time. I shared the master room with the triplets, so each of us had a twin bed. 2 of the beds were on each side of the room, the third one under one bed that could be pulled out when needed, and the fourth, my bed, was at the foot of the second bed, making a backwards L shape. That faced the bedroom door. Fast forward to about 11:30 p.m. We say our goodnights and go to bed. Exhausted from my long day, I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. Now this is where things get scary. I can't exactly remember if I was dreaming or not, but I do remember clear as day waking up to find what felt like someone pinning me down with their hands, one on each shoulder and their knee in the middle of my back. I could feel my blood running with fear. As I lay there frozen, it leaned over and whispered, "Are you awake?" I felt paralyzed, couldn't seem to move or open my eyes. I tried to scream, but all my efforts were useless. Even though I couldn't move, I did feel like I was going to shit myself. That's how scared I was. I again heard the same creepy, sinister voice say, this time in a loud whisper, "I know you're awake." Again, I try to move, but all I can do is pray. As I'm praying for this to stop, I hear the most evil, malicious, vile laugh I have ever heard in my life. I could hear my heart and blood racing. I slowly start gaining control of myself. I manage to sit up. It's dark, but the outside light is bright enough to where you can see where everything is. And that's when I see him, or it. The shadow of a man in what looks to be a trench coat. Now I can't really say in detail what it or he looked like, because it looked like a shadow walking by, and just like that it disappeared. About 5 minutes go by, and I'm now sitting up. I look over at the triplets, and they're all sound asleep. Now I know you guys may think I had some type of sleep paralysis, but I know for sure that was not the case. The next morning, I join my parents for breakfast when I start telling them about my terrifying experience. The story grabs one of my brothers, we'll call him Chris, attention. As I continue with my story, Chris starts walking towards us, and before I could tell them about the evil laugh, he blurts out, "The laugh! You heard the laugh! It was an evil, manly laugh. It made me jump out of my sleep. But when I looked over there was nobody. I closed my eyes again and heard movement on your side of the room, so I peeked, and I just saw you sitting up. I wanted to say something, but I wasn't even sure myself what that was." Shivers went down my spine. Everyone was freaking out, thinking someone might have broke in. We double-checked everywhere for signs of a break-in and found nothing. We have since moved and are living better lives, but if anyone has ever had an experience similar to mine, I would love to hear it. Or if you have an idea on what it could have been, please, I'd like to know. I also forgot to mention that prior to this happening, my upstairs neighbor committed suicide, and he wasn't found till about a week later. This all started at least a week ago. I felt so horribly sick. I couldn't keep down anything without extreme nausea, let alone food. I've lost quite a bit of weight. My head had migraine-level headaches. I felt so miserable, depressed, every waking moment of that week. I grew up in with a whole family who works in the medical field, so I knew you should only worry about a migraine after 15 days. On the last day, I felt my worst. Like running to the bathroom, feeling seconds from throwing up kind of bad. My head hurt so much, I couldn't function. I kept seeing flashes and things darting from the corner of my vision. I would go into these trances where all I could do was stare. I felt so confused and dizzy all week. Emotionally, I was distraught. It got to the point to where I was lying down in the fetal position, crying uncontrollably and praying for the pain to go away. I had put toothpaste all over my nose and upper lip to ease the nausea, and I eventually fell asleep. I kept shivering and twitching uncontrollably, but not quite like a seizure until I fell asleep. I had a very vivid dream. All I saw was blackness, but I heard so much more. I heard a strong voice say, "I call upon the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael." And I might have heard something like ethereal as well, but it all happened so fast I couldn't mentally jot them all down. Then I heard several voices all around me, saying things like, "You're going to be okay. It's all over. The suffering is over." Then I woke up, sitting up and alert. Absolutely no pain or agony. I felt safe and went back to sleep immediately. I woke up later the same morning and I felt refreshed. Just in case, I went all day without eating until I had one slice of bread about an hour ago. I feel a little tired, but much better than yesterday. My stomach hurts a little and feel like shivering as I type this, but every time I stop to take care of some other responsibility, I felt fine. I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm just glad that it's over.